Hello, my name is Mary. On Roblox, I'm known as Arithia, and today I'll be talking about how to develop immersive worlds. For me, world design is so important because it's the space that users are interacting with and a place where they can explore and make their own stories. So a little bit about me, not only am I a map designer, but also I've taught myself how to model, animate, and do simple UI designs in Paint.net, and I'm always looking to learn more, and I tend to avoid scripting. Here's a few of my personal creations. I tend to create things with wings or like fantasy creatures such as dragons and griffins, that kind of stuff. And that is what is inspired by my accelerator project. So today I'm going to be talking about my process of environment design. My flow isn't for everybody. I start with asset creation and go into the map design, choosing whether to use terrain or parts, and then I end it with lighting. So let's get started. First, we're starting with the asset creation. I like to actually create my props before I even start my map. And I like to start by coming up with the style of my game, whether it be high poly, low poly, cartoony, or realistic. So here's an example. I have some pictures from the internet of a higher poly, a more realistic tree on the left, down to the super low poly on the right. We need to take a look at the style that best fits the game. In my experience, cartoony assets work best with simulator games, where higher poly assets work better with RPG style games. So Era of Terra is one of my favorite examples for a more higher poly aesthetic type of game. They combine a high poly dinosaur with high poly vegetation and really great lighting in their world. And if we take a look at My Droplets by Maista, her game is very bright and happy throughout the entire map. You can get an aesthetical shot any place in the map. And I think that's what everybody should reach for. Wherever your users should go, they should be able to take a shot that looks really awesome. Maista also uses really great contrasting colors, and she doesn't have any colors that are too harsh on the eye. All right, so now you should have decided if you want to go with a low poly or high poly asset creation style. I tend to go with low poly. I have one of my dragon examples, and you can see the wireframe beneath it. It's very simple, and I like to keep it that way. I also have a little example of cube and a cone, and how we can apply a simple bevel modifier and combine those to make really easy trees or furniture. Personally, I don't like to use higher poly designs because they're a little bit harder on performance. But I see these designs better in RPG games where your weapons should be more detailed, or in first-person shooter games where your guns need that more detailed aesthetic. And if you do go with this route, you want to use higher poly assets a bit more sparingly throughout your map. All right, so by now, this is where you should have all your assets created, such as your tools, your weapons, vegetation, and buildings. Now, while designing maps, it's very important to take into account whether you'll be using terrain or parts for the base of the map. It's also important to design an interactive and immersive map where users don't get lost in the experience. All right, so I'm going to go over the layout, the size, and the story of your map. Layout is very important because that's where your pathing will go, where users are going to be interacting with the different aspects of your map. The size, we don't want to design a very large map because users can really get easily lost in those maps. And sometimes we may want to develop a story to get users attached to our game. So for those of you who like to create simulators, I believe it's best to keep a small environment designed for these games, and we want the progression to be a little bit more linear. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Pet Sim because I think Pet Sim has a very linear design, and throughout the map, each new zone, it brings something that's a little bit more exciting and new to the user, so they always want to keep going forward. If we take a look at where they're selling their eggs, it's very linear, and it's easy to find your friends because the lobby is centralized and the map is straightforward. If you're going to be designing an RPG game, I like to use terrain for these games because we are going to be having our users interacting with the map a little bit more heavily, whether it be with mobs or NPCs. With terrain, we can achieve a more diverse environment structure and map features that aren't as easily attained using parts. So Jailbreak does a really great job of using terrain. Not only do they use terrain, but they also do a great job at combining low poly assets with a more higher poly terrain aesthetic. They also use a skybox, which enhances the terrain itself. Each terrain of the world has its bright and exciting color. And if we take a look at Vesteria, throughout the world progression, each world has its own theme, and you can really feel that theme as you explore the different locations. Not only that, but if you're in the snow world, the mobs there, they feel like they belong to that world. Or if you go to the beach, there's crabs. The mobs correlate with the world type, and that makes sense. And finally, if you're going to go off and create a different type of world, and it might not be a PvP or a simulator, I always like to do my research on pre-existing games. If we take a look at Royal High and people creating fashion games, I'll join those games and see what kind of map designs they do, whether it's with terrain, parts, what kind of assets they do, and why the users might like that map. Okay, so now we've decided whether we're going to do terrain, parts, and the type of game that we're going to create. Here's a few of my personal creations. And throughout my development on Roblox, I've kind of stylized my work. So more in the Egg Hunt 2019, I really went all out with a pink aesthetic. Or in World Zero's underworld lava volcano area, I really went out with making it feel hot and really volcanic. And a few of the part design maps I've done in the past, I usually do them really cutesy, low poly, and I like terrain better because I have more control over it. So now we're going to go into building our map. So everybody should be starting with gray boxing. This is where you are blocking out the parts of your map where objects are going to be. When I gray box maps, I use a variety of shapes and colors, and I finish it off with a text over it showing where places need to be. And then I'll begin by slowly building on that with the assets that I created, and I'll just keep layering it until I get happy with the design. And this is where I believe most of the development of the map is happening, just layering it, adding your assets, and filling the gray box. And then this is sort of like a final project. This is where I like to go around and ask my community or Twitter how they like the map, if they think the design is good for the game. And sometimes there's something that really big that you might want to change about your map that doesn't fit in with the style of your game. And if you don't love it, it's completely okay to redo it. Well, not completely, but in my case, I felt that using parts really limited user exploration because it's a drag and raising game. You should be flying around and feeling a part of the map. So I wanted to change it to terrain. So as you can see, I started out all the way back from square one, but in the end, I was able to reuse assets, and I felt that the map was way more explorable in the end. Here is another example of starting out with a simple gray box and then building onto that with terrain to part tools, and kind of just building up with your add, subtract, erode, painting tools over and over again until you get the aesthetic that you like. Sometimes you might not even want to gray box, so in this example, it was kind of just a project that I did on a whim. I just felt like doing terrain, and it turned into Feline's Destiny. All right, so by this point, you should have a pretty good map built, and we're going to go into lighting. And this lighting is really important because it's what's going to be bringing your map to life and make your world a little bit more interesting. So with lighting, we can create mood and feelings with specific shades of colors in the lighting studio settings. We can also make the user more interested in the map by paying attention to smaller details such as weather, day and night cycles, or water. So in Jailbreak, they have a really interesting water system where it almost appears to glow at night, or if you jump in it, it'll glow with your character. This is a really easily attained effect where if you go into your studio settings, you set the watercolor to a very vibrant and cyan color, change the transparency as you like, and you can yourself achieve this as well. And I use that for Feline's Destiny, so the water looks really crystallized anywhere you go. Jailbreak also has a really great weather system. It's really interactive when your game isn't just day and night, but weather also changes. And then we'll go into day and night. I think day and night cycles are very important because when your game is constantly day, it can get a little repetitive for players who like to constantly play your game. And we don't have to make day super bright, and we don't have to make night super dark. So I have a little example here. Here's some simple day settings. So sometimes I'll use light yellows, blues, purples, or browns for my day. And at night, I like to go with a more galaxy color, like light purples, blues, and some cyans. And day and night cycles are pretty important because as you can see, the assets and the terrain changes. And it's usually a welcome change. And if you can get your day and night cycle to tween and have an evening or a night, or like a before night, those are pretty interesting as well. Jailbreak does a really great example of this. When you're out in the middle of nowhere, you're not blind at night. You can actually see around you. And when you're in the city, it feels like you're in a city with all the night lights. And you can see their morning is really beautiful. Their skybox changes according to the weather or day and night. And it enhances the terrain and map. All right, and this is where I see a lot of games trip up. It's where you should be adding colors to your light settings. You can add simple colors, such as blues, purples, and browns. And as you can see in the top, this is what I used to do when I first joined Roblox. I would just make my black a lighter white or gray. And as you can see, that doesn't really enhance the map. It's kind of just plain, where adding simple colors can enhance the assets in the map and also the terrain itself. So in Pet Sim, we see their colors are very vibrant and in your face, but if you look in the fountain underneath it, they use a pink lighting, and that makes it a little bit softer, so when you're walking around the map, it's not as blinding. And in Jailbreak, they actually look at color theory, and you see the blue and the orange are across the color wheel, so they complement each other really well, and they use this theme throughout the map. Also, colors that work really well, purple and yellow, and red and green. All right, so this section is like personal experience, my tips with terrain. My first and most important tip is players should be able to explore the world and actually want to explore. If your players are in your map and not really knowing what to do, then that's not a very good sign. In Dragon's Life by Shy Fox, she has great environments such as the volcano world, where you can be a fire dragon and have that location to have a role play as that character. She also, in the same game, has an ice world, where if you want to be an ice dragon, you can go there. Another important feature for role play or interactive social games is concentrated locations where players can recognize and flock to and involve more people in their role play. In Shy Fox's Dragon's Life game, that would be the adoption center. So that's a really great place where users recognize and can go to find new friends and involve them in their role play. Another thing to make your map more explorable is having fun color and terrain height different locations. So involving different shades of green or making your rocks blue or something, just having a little bit of difference. And then in the terrain, if you have a base plate that's completely flat throughout, that can get really boring for users. So it's more interactive if you have different levels of terrain, like mountains or hills or caves that they can travel through. My second tip, if you want to have a story in your game and have users more connected to it, this is where you can create a little storyline for them to base their role play or game off of. My third tip, prevent yourself from over-clustering your map with asset spam. Now, obviously, this GIF is a little over-exaggerated, But you should always be thinking about the routes that your players are going to be taking from point A to point B. If you throw in a bunch of random players into your game and they don't know what to do, that's not a very good sign, especially if there's assets cluttered all around them. My fourth tip is it's okay if you have to do map revisions. Like, this is my jungle world for my accelerator project. I started out with parts, and doing it another time, I really fell in love with the entire aesthetic and design. Not only that, but in Feline's Destiny, when I created the trees, I cut out some of the tries, so they looked really spiky and pointy. Players hated it, but in my mind, I knew that when sun rays were added and dynamic lighting was added, I thought it would create really cool shadows. And up until that point, players did not understand what I was going for. My fifth tip, this is a little personal trick that I've learned while developing maps. It's kind of like tapering your terrain tools. And with this, by holding down Shift and click at the same time, you can get sort of like a tapered effect. And I use this a lot for like icicles and ice worlds, or in my jungle world, I used it for like giant trees and logs kind of going over. This is my sixth tip. This is my final tip. You should change up the default terrain tools. The default terrain colors are very boring, and just by changing some simple hues, you can get really interesting map designs, like a vibrant green map or sort of like a dead map by using dull reds, yellows, and browns. Also, another cool thing is if you're designing a snow world, you don't necessarily have to use the snow terrain. When I design snow worlds, I'll be using sandstone or limestone for the bottom of the ground because I feel like that looks more like snow than the actual snow texture. And I know some beginners don't actually know where the terrain tools are, but if you click on terrain and go in your properties, there's a material color expansion tab, and that's where you'll change all your colors.